What if everything you were told was a lie? Not a misunderstanding, not a mistranslation, a lie. Billions of people base their entire lives on a man we have zero physical evidence for. No writings, no birth record, no death certificate, not even a tombstone. Pause. And yet, he is said to be the most important figure in all of human history. So where is the evidence? Visuals. A stained glass window fades into a black screen, followed by silent scrolls, empty Roman archives, and untouched Jewish texts. There's no record of Jesus in any Roman census, not in any Jewish court records, not in any contemporary historian's account, not one. Even Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived during Jesus' supposed lifetime, never mentions him, not once. This isn't fringe speculation. It's not atheist propaganda. It's the consensus of many Christian scholars. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies and author of Misquoting Jesus, admits clearly the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. Pause. Let that sink in. Not written by the people who were there. Not even written by people who knew them. They were composed decades later by anonymous authors. So here's the question. If a man performed miracles, raised the dead, fed thousands with scraps, and rose from the grave, why didn't anyone write about it when it happened? Pause. Why the silence? Why the missing records? Why does the most influential man in history leave behind no trace? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The story of Jesus looks less like biography and more like literature, a constructed narrative, a character crafted to fulfill prophecy. And it gets worse, because even the Gospels, the books billions swear by, don't agree with each other. In fact, the most trusted gospel contradicts itself in a way that no one talks about. Stay with me, because once you see it, you'll never read the Gospels the same again. Let's dig deeper, because the silence is louder than the sermons. Jesus is said to have walked the earth around 4 BCE to 30 CE, healing the blind, raising the dead, feeding thousands, turning water into wine. A life like that, you'd expect someone to notice, to write it down, to document it. But they didn't, not once. Let's start with Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher and historian who lived during the exact same time Jesus supposedly did. He wrote extensively about Jewish life, Roman politics, religious sects, and messianic figures. Do you know how many times he mentions Jesus? 0. Not once. Not a word. He lived just a few miles away from Jerusalem, and yet he never heard of the man who allegedly turned the world upside down. Strange? Let's keep going. Pliny the Elder, Roman author, philosopher, and military commander, wrote volumes on everything from natural history to astronomy. Lived during the same period. Nothing. Seneca the Younger, advisor to Emperor Nero, wrote about everything from ethics to floods, eclipses, and political unrest. Still, nothing. Josephus, a Jewish historian often cited by Christian apologists. He mentions Jesus, but only in a passage widely recognized by scholars as a later forgery. Strip that out, and the silence returns. We're talking about a time when even minor prophets and troublemakers were meticulously recorded. But Jesus, no trial documents, no crucifixion record, no public debate, no crowd testimonies, nothing. Visual timeline fades in. First century authors, dozens of chroniclers, hundreds of documents, all describing the political, religious, and social chaos of the time. And yet, not one mentions the man who allegedly split time in half. Ask yourself, if a man could walk on water, raise the dead, calm storms with a whisper. Why didn't anyone write about it at the time? Why are all the stories secondhand at best and written decades later? It's not just suspicious, it's damning. Because when every source that Gyaos should have said something says nothing at all, you're not dealing with history, you're dealing with myth. And that myth, it might not be original, because here's the twist, the part they never taught you in Sunday school. The Jesus story may have already existed centuries before the New Testament was written, just under a different name. Stick around. This is where it starts to unravel. Let's pull back the curtain. Because the story of Jesus wasn't new, it wasn't unique, and it wasn't first. Long before Jesus of Nazareth, the world had already heard this story. The details may shock you, but they are carved into stone, etched in myth and whispered through ancient temples. Let's start with Horus, an Egyptian god, worshipped thousands of years before Christianity. He was born of a virgin. His birth was marked by a star in the east. He was baptized in a river, tempted in the desert, performed miracles, had 12 followers, and yes, he was crucified, died, and resurrected. Sound familiar? Then there's Mithras, the Persian deity, born on December 25th from a virgin, celebrated by shepherds and wise men, performed miracles, called the light of the world, and rose from the dead to grant salvation, centuries before Jesus. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, born of a mortal woman and a divine father, turned water into wine, rode into town on a donkey, killed, and brought back to life. Attis of Phrygia, born of a virgin, died under a tree, resurrected 3 days later. Krishna from ancient India, born of a virgin, performed miracles, crucified, rose again, and is still worshipped as a divine incarnation. And we're only scratching the surface. Visual timeline appears. Overlay these myths, stack their details, line them up against the Gospels. You'll start to notice it's the same script over and over, just with different names, different locations, different symbols. Ask yourself, is it divine coincidence or is it human storytelling repackaged and rebranded? Because both can't be true. Either Christianity borrowed from the ancient world, or these ancient gods coincidentally lived the same life as Jesus, centuries before. And here's the uncomfortable part. The similarities aren't surface level. They're structural. They're sequential. They follow a pattern, a blueprint. Why would a god's life need to follow the same pattern as mythical figures that came before? Why does the savior of mankind look so much like Horus, Mithras, Dionysus? This isn't speculation, it's documentation, written myths, sculptures, temple inscriptions, rituals, all preserved, long before the first gospel was ever penned. So here's the intellectual challenge. If you reject the stories of Horus, of Mithras, of Krishna, because they're just mythology, then what do you do with the fact that Jesus' story matches them? Detail for detail. Think about it. Is it a divine truth repeating itself across cultures, or is it just the same old myth with a new name? And the most copied element, the part that shows up again and again, is found in the crucifixion itself. And what you're about to discover about that moment might change everything. Let's talk about the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They're treated like eyewitnesses, first-hand accounts, direct reports from the men who walked with Jesus. But here's the truth. They weren't. None of the Gospel writers ever met Jesus. None were disciples. And none even claimed to be. Let that sink in. The names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, were added later. The original manuscripts, completely anonymous. No signatures, no personal references, no, "I saw this with my own eyes." These weren't eyewitnesses. They were authors, writing decades after the events. Mark, written around 70 CE. Matthew and Luke, around 80 to 90 CE. John, pushed all the way to 95 or even 100 CE. That's 40 to 70 years after Jesus supposedly died. And by then, the eyewitnesses, if there were any, were long gone. So what were these writers relying on? Oral tradition. Stories passed down. Spoken, reshaped, edited, reimagined. Now think about this. If the core story is already decades old and passed by word of mouth, how accurate can it be? Even seminary professors admit this quietly. But it gets worse, because even these Gospels, our best sources, contradict each other. Start with something simple, the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew traces Jesus through Solomon. Luke traces him through Nathan. Same father, different sons. Can't be both. Now look at Jesus' final words on the cross. In Matthew, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, he says, "Mother, into your hands I commit my spirit." In John, he simply says, "It is finished." 3 different endings for the most important death in history. Which one is true? Then there's the resurrection. Who found the tomb? Was it Mary alone? Or Mary with other women? Was the stone already rolled away? Or did they see it moved? Did they meet angels? Or a man in white? Did Jesus appear to the disciples immediately? Or later, on the road? The answers depend entirely on which gospel you're reading. This isn't nitpicking. These are fundamental differences. And if the witnesses can't agree, how can you believe the story? Ask yourself honestly, if 4 eyewitnesses gave different names, different timelines, different last words in a courtroom, would you trust the verdict? So why do we trust the Gospels? Because we were taught to. But what happens when you untangle the contradictions? When you remove the authority, the assumptions, the fear? You're left with a story held together by tradition, not evidence. But wait, we haven't even touched the biggest forgeries in the New Testament. And once you see what was added, you'll question everything else. Now we enter the part almost no one talks about, the forgeries, actual confirmed fabrications inserted into the Bible after it was written. Let's start with 2 Peter. Most scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, agree that this letter was not written by Peter. The language is different. The theology is different. The timeline doesn't match. It's widely considered a forgery. Then there's Paul's letters. 7 are considered authentic, but others like 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are disputed or outright rejected by mainstream biblical scholars. The writing style is off. The historical context is wrong, and they seem to push church hierarchy that didn't exist at the time. In other words, they were written later by someone else. Then comes one of the most famous stories in the entire New Testament. John 7:53 to 8:11. The woman caught in adultery, the crowd, the stoning, Jesus kneeling in the dirt. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Iconic, quotable, powerful, but it wasn't in the original manuscripts. The earliest and most reliable copies of the Gospel of John don't include it. It was added centuries later. A beautiful moment. That never happened. Let that sink in. You were taught this as divine truth. You heard it preached from the pulpit. You saw it in movies. You felt it in your soul. But it was inserted long after the fact, not just embellished. Inserted. Ask yourself, if parts of the Bible were added, if stories were made up, What does that say about the parts you were told never changed? 1 John 5:7. Another example. A verse used for centuries to justify the Trinity doctrine. Modern scholars and Bible publishers have admitted it's not original, it was added. These aren't opinions, they're facts, documented through manuscript comparisons, dating methods, and admissions by biblical scholars and Christian universities. The Bible, sirs, was altered, not just translated, not just interpreted, altered by people with agendas. You were taught this as sacred, untouchable, perfect. But what if that's the biggest illusion of all? If the Bible was altered, what else have they been hiding? Most people who believe aren't lying. They were lied to from childhood, before they could question, before they could reason, before they even knew what belief was. Told stories as facts, taught fear as truth, trained to obey, not to ask. The fear of hell wasn't just a warning, it was a leash. And if you grew up in it, if your family still believes it, if every Sunday was a ritual of guilt and praise and silence, it's not your fault. You're not weak for having doubts. You're not broken for asking questions. You're not crazy for wondering why truth needs to be protected by fear. You're finally thinking, and you're not alone. Millions have walked away, quietly, bravely, thoughtfully. People like Dan Barker, a former preacher who now writes about freedom from religion, or Bart Ehrman, who went from believer to scholar to truth teller. You are not the first to feel the weight of questions, and you won't be the last to set them down and finally breathe. Because there's a growing community of people who stopped pretending. They don't need a label. They just need truth. And if you're here, still watching, still thinking, you've already taken the first step. Welcome. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the silence. You've watched the contradictions unfold. No records, no witnesses, no originals, only stories. Rewritten, reshaped, and repackaged. History didn't forget Jesus. History never found him. That's not blasphemy. That's reality. And seeing it, facing it, takes courage. Because once you start questioning, you can't go back. You begin to see the pattern, the control, the comfort of belief, built on borrowed myths. But here's the truth. You're not alone in this. There's a whole community of people who once asked the same forbidden questions, and they found freedom on the other side of fear. If this changed how you see the story, imagine what else you've been shielded from. Subscribe. Stay curious, because we're just getting started.